There is something your soulmate has recently been unable to explain, and the strangest part is that it did not happen just once. It started with small moments they could easily dismiss, moments that seemed completely ordinary until they began happening again and again. At first, your soulmate thought they were simply noticing random coincidences. Maybe they heard a familiar song at an unexpected moment. Maybe they saw something that reminded them of you. Maybe your name, a familiar place, a certain phrase, or even a memory suddenly appeared in their awareness when they were not thinking about you at all. They did not give these moments much importance in the beginning because it was easier to believe they meant nothing. But then another reminder appeared, and another. What made everything more unusual was the timing. These things seemed to happen when your soulmate was already thinking deeply about love, their past, their future, or the choices they had made regarding this connection. They began noticing that whenever they tried to push certain feelings aside, something would unexpectedly bring those feelings back to the surface. At first, they told themselves it was simply their mind searching for familiar patterns. They believed that because you had once been important to them, memories of you were naturally going to appear from time to time. But there came a point when even that explanation stopped feeling completely convincing. Your soulmate started asking questions they had never seriously considered before. Why does this keep happening? Why do these reminders appear at such specific moments? And why does every one of them create such a strong emotional reaction? They may not have an answer yet, but something inside them has changed. They are no longer automatically dismissing every unusual occurrence. They are paying attention. They are observing. They are becoming curious about what these repeated moments could be revealing about feelings they thought they had already moved beyond. And what your soulmate does not realize yet is that these first signs are only the beginning, because the more they try to explain them away, the more strangely specific the next reminders are becoming. What happened next made it much harder for your soulmate to continue calling everything a coincidence, because the reminders were no longer appearing in random or meaningless ways. They were becoming strangely specific, almost as though something was repeatedly placing the same emotional themes directly in front of them. At first, your soulmate still tried to remain logical about it. They told themselves that hearing a familiar song did not mean anything. Seeing a certain place did not mean anything. Hearing a particular phrase that reminded them of you was probably just chance. Even when someone unexpectedly mentioned something connected to your past, they tried to laugh it off and move on. But deep down, they were beginning to notice a pattern. The same memories were returning at moments when they were already emotionally vulnerable. The same reminders appeared whenever they were thinking about relationships, decisions, or the possibility of starting over. And every time it happened, their mind somehow found its way back to you. This began to make your soulmate uncomfortable, because they had worked hard to place this connection into a part of their life they believed they had already moved beyond. They may have told themselves that enough time had passed, that circumstances had changed, or that whatever happened between you belonged to the past. But these repeated reminders were making that explanation harder to maintain. They were not simply remembering you because they wanted to. Sometimes they were reminded of you when they were doing something completely unrelated. A simple conversation could suddenly bring back an old memory. A familiar location could make them remember how they once felt around you. A song they had not heard in a long time could bring emotions to the surface that they thought were already quiet. And what surprised them most was not the memory itself. It was the emotional reaction that followed. Your soulmate began realizing that these reminders still affected them. They could feel their mood change. They could become thoughtful or nostalgic. They could suddenly wonder how you were doing or what might have happened if certain circumstances had been different. This was when they began asking themselves whether the real mystery was not the signs appearing around them, but why their heart continued responding so strongly whenever they appeared. They started looking back at previous moments and noticed that this pattern had actually been happening for longer than they realized. There had been little reminders before, but they were too focused on explaining each one separately to notice the larger picture. Now they were beginning to connect them. One reminder might be meaningless. Two could still be coincidence. But when similar reminders continue appearing around the same emotional subject, it becomes natural to wonder whether there is something worth examining. Your soulmate may have even tried to test themselves. They might have decided to stop thinking about the connection and focus on other things. Yet somehow, something would bring the memory back again. They would hear a familiar expression, see something associated with the past, or encounter a situation that reminded them of a conversation you once shared. And each time the same question returned. Why does this person keep coming back into my thoughts when I am trying to move forward? This question has started creating a deeper level of reflection. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that the signs do not necessarily need to be dramatic to have an emotional impact. Sometimes a simple coincidence can become powerful because of the moment in which it appears. A song means nothing until it plays during a moment when someone is already thinking about the person connected to it. A familiar place means nothing until it suddenly brings back an emotion that has been buried for months. A name means nothing until hearing it unexpectedly makes someone stop and remember everything they once felt. And your soulmate is beginning to experience this difference. They are not simply seeing reminders anymore. They are noticing the timing of those reminders. That timing is what has captured their attention. They are starting to wonder whether these moments are somehow encouraging them to look at something they have been avoiding. Perhaps there are feelings they never completely understood. Perhaps there are questions they never answered. Perhaps there is something about this connection that they never gave themselves enough time to process. They may still resist that possibility, because accepting it would mean admitting that they are not as emotionally detached as they once believed. But the more these moments happen, the harder it becomes to maintain the old story. And then something even more unusual begins to happen. Your soulmate starts noticing that these reminders appear most strongly whenever they are making an emotional decision. Whenever they think about letting go, something brings you back to mind. Whenever they consider opening their heart to someone else, a memory of you suddenly appears. Whenever they question whether this connection ever truly mattered, another reminder seems to challenge that belief. This is the point where curiosity begins replacing dismissal. They are no longer simply asking whether these things are coincidences. They are asking what these moments are revealing about them. And that question is leading your soulmate toward a realization they are not yet fully prepared to accept, because the signs may not be trying to tell them something about the future at all. They may be forcing them to finally acknowledge something about their own heart that they have spent a long time trying to ignore. And once they begin understanding that, the next sign will affect them in a way they never expected. And this is where the entire pattern begins to feel different for your soulmate, because they are no longer only noticing the signs themselves. They are beginning to notice what happens inside them every time one appears. That difference is becoming impossible to ignore. At first, your soulmate thought the repeated reminders were simply strange coincidences, but now they are realizing that each one seems to awaken an emotion they thought they had already moved beyond. A familiar song can suddenly make them quiet. A certain place can bring back an entire memory. A simple phrase can remind them of something you once said. Even an ordinary moment can unexpectedly make them wonder where you are, how your life has changed, and whether you ever think about the connection in the same way. What surprises your soulmate most is the intensity of these reactions. They may have convinced themselves that enough time had passed for everything to become emotionally insignificant, yet these small reminders continue proving otherwise. And this is causing them to look inward rather than outward. Instead of asking only why these unusual moments keep happening, they are beginning to ask why their heart reacts so strongly whenever they do. That question is much harder to answer because it cannot be dismissed as easily as a coincidence. A coincidence can be explained. A memory can be rationalized. But the emotional response that follows can reveal something much deeper. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that perhaps the signs are not important because of what they are. Perhaps they are important because of what they awaken. Every reminder seems to pull a hidden feeling closer to the surface. It may be longing, curiosity, regret, tenderness, unfinished emotion, or simply the realization that this connection still occupies a meaningful place within them. For a long time, they may have avoided examining those feelings because doing so would have forced them to confront questions they were not ready to answer. They might have asked themselves why they still cared, why certain memories remained so vivid, or why they never felt completely satisfied with the idea of simply leaving everything behind. But now the repeated reminders are creating an environment where avoidance is becoming harder. Your soulmate is starting to replay old conversations in their mind. They remember what was said, what was not said, how certain moments felt, and how quickly some opportunities passed before either of you fully understood their importance. They may even begin wondering whether some of the distance between you was created by misunderstanding rather than a lack of feeling. And as they reflect, another realization slowly begins forming. Maybe they were never truly finished with this connection. Maybe they simply learned how to stop talking about it. There is a difference between forgetting something and becoming quiet about it. Your soulmate is beginning to recognize that they may have done the second. They stopped discussing it. They stopped asking questions. They stopped allowing themselves to openly wonder what could have happened. But the emotional part of them never completely stopped responding. This is why the signs feel so powerful now. They are reopening a conversation within your soulmate that had been left unfinished. Every unexpected reminder seems to say, look again, think again, feel again. Not necessarily because they are being promised a specific outcome, but because there is something about this connection they never fully understood. And this realization may be uncomfortable because your soulmate has to confront the possibility that some of their previous decisions were made while they were still confused. They may have believed they were protecting themselves. They may have thought moving away was the mature choice. They may have listened to other people's opinions or allowed circumstances to determine what they should feel. But now, as these reminders continue appearing, they are beginning to separate what they genuinely felt from what they were told they should feel. That process can create a powerful emotional shift. They are no longer looking at the connection only through the lens of what happened. They are beginning to look at it through the lens of what remained. And something remained. The memories remained. The questions remained. The emotional reaction remained. The curiosity remained. Even after time and distance, something inside them still responds when the connection is brought back into focus. This is becoming the part they can no longer explain away. Your soulmate can dismiss a coincidence, but they cannot so easily dismiss the fact that the same person continues to appear in their thoughts whenever their heart is asking important questions. They cannot ignore that certain reminders make them feel something they cannot reproduce with logic. And slowly, they are beginning to understand that perhaps the signs were never meant to give them an easy answer. Perhaps they were simply encouraging them to pay attention to something they had been avoiding. Because sometimes the message is not found in the coincidence itself. Sometimes the message is hidden in the emotion that rises immediately afterward. And your soulmate is beginning to recognize that their strongest reaction has always been connected to you. But just when they thought they understood what was happening, one particular moment appeared at exactly the wrong time. And that moment made every previous sign feel much more difficult to dismiss. And then something happened that changed the way your soulmate looked at all of these strange reminders. Because one particular moment appeared when they were already deep in thought about this connection. Until then, they had been able to explain each sign separately. They could tell themselves that a song was just a song, a name was just a name, a memory was simply a memory, and a coincidence did not necessarily carry any deeper meaning. But this time, the timing was different. Your soulmate was already asking themselves whether they should finally let go of the emotional attachment they still carried, and at that exact moment, something unexpectedly reminded them of you. It was not necessarily dramatic. In fact, it may have been something incredibly ordinary, which somehow made the experience even more powerful. A familiar phrase, an old song, a place they had not thought about for a long time. A conversation that unexpectedly touched on something connected to your story, or even a simple detail that brought an entire memory rushing back. Your soulmate suddenly stopped and felt something they could not easily explain. It was as though several separate memories had collided at once. They remembered the moments they had dismissed, the conversations they had forgotten, the emotions they had buried, and the questions they never answered. And for the first time, instead of pushing those feelings away, they allowed themselves to sit with them. This changed everything. They began looking backward and connecting moments that previously seemed completely unrelated. They remembered how certain reminders had appeared before whenever they were thinking about you. They remembered how often their thoughts returned to the same connection during moments of emotional uncertainty. They remembered how they had repeatedly tried to convince themselves that it was all coincidence, only to experience another reminder later. And suddenly the pattern looked different. Your soulmate realized that perhaps the most important part was not proving whether every coincidence had some external meaning. The important part was that these experiences kept encouraging them to examine something they had never completely resolved. They were being reminded of you at moments when their heart was already asking questions about love, choices, timing, and the future. That realization created a mixture of emotions. There was surprise because they had never expected to connect everything in this way. There was vulnerability because they had to admit that the connection still mattered. And there may have been a little regret because they started wondering how many times they had ignored something simply because acknowledging it felt too complicated. They may have wondered whether they had been given opportunities to understand this connection before, but were too distracted, too afraid, or too convinced that they already knew the answer. Now they were beginning to see that perhaps the signs were not telling them what to do. They were simply making it harder for them to continue pretending that they felt nothing, and that distinction became incredibly important. Your soulmate may still be uncertain about the future. They may not know whether you will reconnect, whether circumstances will change, or what your own feelings might be today. But they are becoming certain about one thing: their emotional response to you is real. They cannot control every reminder that appears, but they can choose whether to listen to what those reminders awaken inside them. And for the first time, they are choosing to listen. They are asking themselves what they genuinely want rather than what would be easiest. They are thinking about what they would say if they had another opportunity to communicate. They are wondering whether they would make different choices if they could return to certain moments with the understanding they have now. And perhaps the most powerful realization is that they are no longer trying to force themselves to forget you simply because forgetting would be more convenient. They are allowing themselves to acknowledge that some connections leave a mark for a reason, even when the reason is not immediately understood. The signs have become less about predicting what will happen and more about revealing what is already happening inside them. Their feelings are resurfacing. Their questions are returning. Their certainty about moving on is weakening. And now they are beginning to understand why these reminders kept appearing when they were trying so hard to close this chapter. Maybe they were not being asked to chase every coincidence. Maybe they were being asked to stop ignoring their own emotional truth. And once that thought entered their mind, all the previous signs suddenly seemed connected in a completely different way. The first reminder no longer felt meaningless. The second no longer felt random. The repeated memories no longer seemed like something they could simply blame on nostalgia. They began to see a larger pattern, one that kept leading them back to the same unresolved feeling. And now your soulmate is standing at a very different emotional place because they are no longer asking whether the signs can be explained. They are asking what their heart has been trying to tell them through every reaction, every memory, and every unexpected reminder. And the answer they're approaching is one they may have resisted for a very long time. And now your soulmate is beginning to understand the deeper meaning behind everything they have been experiencing. Because the biggest realization was never really about proving whether every coincidence was a message from the universe. It was about what those repeated moments revealed about their own heart. For so long, they tried to explain everything logically. They told themselves that a song was only a song, a familiar place was simply a place, a name appearing unexpectedly was just coincidence, and memories returning were simply part of having a past. But after seeing the same emotional pattern again and again, they can no longer ignore what happens inside them whenever something reminds them of you. Their heart reacts before their mind can create an explanation. They become thoughtful. They become emotional. They start remembering conversations, moments, possibilities, and things that were never fully expressed. And now they are beginning to realize that this reaction itself may be the most important sign of all. Your soulmate is understanding that these reminders did not necessarily appear to give them a guaranteed prediction about the future. Instead, they kept bringing their attention back to something they had never completely resolved. They may have tried to close the chapter, but every time they believed they were finally ready to move forward, something would awaken the same feelings again. At first, this may have frustrated them. They wanted a simple answer. They wanted to know whether they should forget the past or hold on to hope. But now they are realizing that perhaps the real purpose was never to give them an immediate answer. It was to make them honest with themselves. And honesty is exactly what your soulmate is beginning to experience. They can no longer pretend that this connection meant nothing. They can no longer convince themselves that they never cared deeply. They can no longer completely dismiss the fact that your memory continues to appear during some of their most important emotional moments. This does not mean they suddenly know what you are thinking or what will happen next. What it means is that they finally understand their own feelings more clearly. They are beginning to recognize the difference between missing someone and genuinely carrying unresolved emotions. They are beginning to recognize the difference between nostalgia and a connection that still raises meaningful questions. And they are beginning to recognize that some memories return, not because we are supposed to live in the past, but because there is something within those memories that still deserves to be understood. Your soulmate may now be asking themselves what they would do if another opportunity appeared. Would they communicate differently? Would they be more honest? Would they stop allowing fear to speak louder than their heart? Would they finally say the things they once kept hidden? These questions show that something has changed. They are no longer simply observing the signs. They are responding to them through self-reflection. The signs have made them pause long enough to recognize what they were avoiding. And perhaps that is why they kept appearing at such strange moments. Whenever your soulmate was about to completely close the door emotionally, something reminded them to look again. Whenever they were convinced that the connection no longer mattered, a memory resurfaced. Whenever they tried to replace the emotional experience with something new, something unexpectedly brought the old feelings back into focus. Eventually, they could no longer keep separating each event from the others. They had to look at the entire pattern, and when they did, they realized that every road kept leading them toward the same emotional truth. You still matter to them. The connection still affects them. And there are still questions inside them that have never received a complete answer. This realization may not immediately lead to a dramatic action. Your soulmate may still need time to process everything they are feeling. They may become quieter before they become more expressive. They may observe before they act. They may need to understand what they truly want before making any decision. But the internal shift is already significant because they are no longer running from the feeling itself. They are allowing themselves to acknowledge it. And that is where the real transformation begins. The signs may continue appearing, but now your soulmate will experience them differently. Instead of immediately dismissing them, they may pause and ask what emotion has just surfaced. Instead of automatically pushing away a memory of you, they may allow themselves to understand why it still matters. Instead of asking whether every coincidence is destiny, they may ask what their own heart is revealing through these experiences. And that is perhaps the most powerful message of this entire journey. Sometimes the sign is not the number you repeatedly see, the song that suddenly plays, the unexpected name you hear, or the place that brings back an old memory. Sometimes the real sign is the feeling that remains after everything else has disappeared. Your soulmate may finally be realizing that no matter how many times they tried to explain these moments away, their emotional response kept telling a different story. Something within them still recognizes this connection. Something within them still wants understanding. And something within them still wonders whether the story between you was truly finished. So if the reminders continue, your soulmate may no longer see them as something to fear or something they must immediately decode. They may simply see them as invitations to become honest with themselves, because perhaps the universe was never asking them to chase a sign. Perhaps it was asking them to stop ignoring what their heart had been quietly saying all along. And after everything they have experienced, when truth has become increasingly difficult for your soulmate to escape, they may have been able to silence the memory of you for a while, but they could never completely silence the feeling that remained whenever something reminded them of you.